Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Now TV. And my name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is what I call my morning musings. We have been and we are involved in a study of the challenge of Christ. And that challenge is found in John chapter 10, verse 37, where Jesus, standing in front of a hostile crowd, standing in front of a group of people that would have loved nothing better than to have found him guilty of some sin, to find some fault with his teaching. And of course, they tried, John chapter 5, they accused him of violating the Sabbath. John chapter 9 tried to accuse him of violating the Sabbath. And of course, he completely refuted their claims. So much so that in John chapter 8, on another occasion, obviously very close akin to John chapter 10, but Jesus, standing in front of another hostile crowd, said, "Which of you convicts me of sin?" Now, mind you, once again, they tried. They tried to find fault with him, but they couldn't. They had to admit, for instance, in the case of the resurrection of Lazarus, we got to do something about this guy because everyone knows what he did. We can't deny what he did, but if we leave him alone, the whole nation's going to go after him. Well, how horrible would that be to follow a man who irrefutably, undeniably demonstrated the power of God to raise someone from the dead? Oh, that would be awful, wouldn't it? But that's the way the Pharisees looked at it. So anyway, we have been examining the challenge of Christ. And I was privileged a couple of weeks ago to appear on an internet blog, radio/video program. Now, the guy who runs the program, he was very gracious, very friendly, and I must say he was also very impressed. But he's an unbeliever, along with several other people, and evidently his audience is comprised basically of either estranged Christians or atheists and agnostics and unbelievers. What was so interesting to me about that program was, and I must say again, he was very gracious. He didn't mount a full frontal assault on Christianity, and he did not attack the preterist view. Basically, he inquired, how did you come to be where you are today? And so I explained, and I presented the challenge of Christ. He was totally unfamiliar with it, although, like I said, he's currently a skeptic. But when I began to develop the challenge of Christ and how distinctive Jesus' own challenge is, he was more than impressed. As I shared the fact, Jesus' challenge, not to believe him if he did not do the things that he said he was going to do, stands alone in the annals of historical religions. As I pointed out, because when I made that comment, no other religion issues that challenge. He goes, "What?" I said, well, look at it like this. The Buddhists do not welcome that kind of an investigation. The Hindus don't. The Muslims most assuredly don't. I said Judaism is the closest to it. They welcome historical investigation, if you please. But I said Jesus is the only leader of a world religion that just openly said and challenges us even to this very day, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. This guy was impressed. A couple of days after the program, he sent me a very, very nice message on Instant Messenger saying that that program, that interview, had garnered more interest, more comments, than any other program, any other guest that he had ever had on. So I was very pleased about that. But ladies and gentlemen, it shows you how important how important it is that we number one, that we be aware of the challenge of Christ. Number two, that we be able to answer the challenge of Christ. I mean, after all, I was appearing on a program in which the basic premise of the program is we don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. We don't believe the Bible is inspired. And yet he told me, I have to tell you, this has been a very, very interesting program. And his body language during the entirety of the program said he was hearing things that he had never heard before. He was hearing things for which he had no answer. He couldn't challenge what I was saying. And thus, his body language said to me, he was genuinely interested in what I was presenting on how to answer the challenge of Christ. Now, we have turned our attention to the book of Revelation. My premise has been this. Point number one, most evangelical believers wind up sooner or later wanting to go to the book of Revelation. Just this morning, all right, as I was on Facebook, I was actually visiting a dispensational discussion forum. And they've allowed me to post there from time to time. Most of the people sure don't like it, but since I stay within the confines of asking questions and I don't attack the views of those who are on there, which is not my modus operandi anyway, but since I don't do any of those things, and I challenge people to think, that then they've allowed me to post. So I posted on there about the challenge of Christ. And instead of answering the challenge, one individual who I could tell was a constant poster on there and a very firmly devout dispensationalist said, well, the problem with what you're saying is it just didn't happen. Because you see, this individual has the same literalistic perspective of the day of the Lord, coming of the Lord, parousia, end of the age, etc., that I used to believe. And that the great majority of believers today accept. That when Jesus said he was going to come back in the glory of the Father with his angels in judgment of every man in that generation, he didn't come because nobody saw him descend out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man on a literal cumulus cloud with a myriad of angels. So because they have that literalistic perspective about the nature of the coming of the Lord, they just cannot accept the time statements about when the Lord said he was going to come. And to return to this blog post and the host, after I presented several things about the nature of the coming of the Lord, what it meant for Jesus to say he was going to come in the glory of the Father, he said, well, okay then, I think I'm starting to follow you. How then are you saying that Jesus came in the first century? And I said, well, just like the Father had used the Assyrians to destroy the Egyptians, Isaiah 19 and 20, and he had followed me very well on that. I said, just like Yahweh used the Assyrians to destroy the Babylonians, and he followed me on that. Just like Yahweh used Assyria to destroy the 10 northern tribes, Micah chapter 1, and just like the Lord used the Babylonians to destroy the 2 southern tribes, carrying them off into captivity, that's how Jesus used the Romans to come in judgment and destruction of Old Covenant Israel and the end of the age in AD 70. I mean, after all, he said he was going to come in the glory of the Father. He said he was going to act in judgment as he had seen the Father act in judgment. John chapter 5, 21 through 23. Ladies and gentlemen, I've said this many times before on this program, until and unless we begin to accept what the Bible says about the nature of the coming of the Lord that Jesus never predicted, never said he was going to come back as a 5'5" Jewish man, but rather he was going to come back in the glory of the Father, in the way that he had seen his Father come in judgment. He was going to be revealed as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, not a Jewish man in a physical body. Failure to understand this opens us wide open for the attacks of the atheists, the agnostics, the Jews, and the Muslims who say, oh, see, he promised to come back as a 5'5" Jewish man. He didn't do it. No, that's not what he promised. Okay, so people go to the book of Revelation and they say, see, Preston, Christ hasn't come. And of course, they get it into their head. Babylon is literal Babylon in Iraq, which doesn't work. Babylon is even America, which doesn't work. They ignore, essentially, every single thing that the Bible has to say about the identifying elements and tenets, doctrines and motifs that are found explicitly in the book of Revelation. And they start saying, well, obviously, the Lord hasn't come. He obviously hasn't come because he hasn't destroyed a 100 million man army, trampling them under his feet. See, he hasn't come. Just this week, I received an email from a lady who said, you know, Dr. Preston, I've read a good bit of your articles, and I've been watching your blog. But she said, I am horribly confused. And she began to lay out all of the, quote, traditional, unquote, teaching about the identity of Babylon being the Roman Catholic Church. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I was raised with that belief. I was ardent in that belief. I once heard a very prominent minister in the Churches of Christ by the name of F.I. Stanley preach for one solid week on the book of Revelation and the identity of Babylon in the book of Revelation, laying it all out with beautiful, beautiful artwork on sheets, seeking to prove that Babylon of Revelation was none other than the Roman Catholic Church and that the Pope was the man of sin. Look, I was 11, 12 years old. I was absolutely hooked. I believed it with all of my heart. That's what I preached and taught thereafter when I began public speaking and what have you when I was 13 years old. So anyway, I mean, to me, it was just stunningly convincing until I really started studying the Bible for myself. And I soon realized that all of these arguments, all of these beautiful, supposedly, arguments that I had been making for all of these years were fundamentally flawed. Those arguments are not found in the book of Revelation. And here's what's ironic, and here's what's thrilling. After I had become a full preterist years ago, all right, I saw a reference in a book to a book entitled As a Lamb Slain by F.I. Stanley, the same minister that I had heard when I was 11, 12 years old, who had presented such an amazingly convincing week of teaching that Babylon of Revelation was none other than the Roman Catholic Church. But this book, As a Lamb Slain, presents the case for full preterism. F.I. Stanley had changed his views radically and had become a full preterist. Okay, so the book of Revelation presents to us the challenge of Christ. The book of Revelation presents some incredible challenges to us because the book begins by saying, these things must shortly come to pass. The time is at hand. It says in the middle of the book, this woe is past, the other woe comes quickly. And it closes in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 22, with 6 separate, distinct, emphatic statements that the time for the fulfillment of Revelation had come. It was coming very soon. That flies in the face, ladies and gentlemen, of all futurist views, who they take us to the book of Revelation and they say, you see, we've got all the seals, we got the trumpets, we've got the bowls. All of those things haven't happened yet. We're waiting for the outpouring of the 7th bowl of God's wrath. We're waiting for the last trumpet because, after all, the 7th trumpet of Revelation chapter 11 is the last trumpet for the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. And everyone knows the resurrection hasn't occurred yet, right? So that's how they approach the book of Revelation. So over the last several weeks, I've been presenting to you the following argument. If it is true that the time statements of the book of Revelation are to be taken in their objective, prosaic, literal, normal manner, then all futurist views of eschatology, all futurist views of the book of Revelation are falsified. Because you cannot have a view of the book of Revelation that accepts the time statements literally, as they were intended to be taken, and say, okay, John wrote in the 1st century, and look, let me say, I've got to interject this. You can't even take the position that the book of Revelation was written in 95, 98 AD in the time of Domitian and still hold to a futurist eschatology of the coming of the Lord at the supposed end of time. Because if you take the view that Revelation was written in 95, 98 AD, it still had to be fulfilled quickly, soon, shortly. Not 2,000 years. Pardon me. Not 2,000 years later. So, we'll be dealing specifically with the time statements as they relate to the dating of the book of Revelation in future programs. But my premise, once again, is if we can take, and if we are to take, the time statements of Scripture in the book of Revelation, literally, prosaically, then that means that all futurist eschatologies are false. Now, for the last 3 weeks, I've shared with you Luke chapter 21 and verse 8. The bottom line is this, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus said, false prophets are going to come saying, the end has drawn near, the time has drawn near, do not go after them. He therefore condemned premature declarations of the nearness of the end. Peter was one of those apostles. John was one of those apostles who heard Jesus warn against saying, the time has drawn near. The end has drawn near. And yet Peter in 1 Peter chapter 4 said, the end of all things has drawn near. Therefore the question, was Peter one of the very false apostles or false teachers that Jesus warned him about when he said, many false prophets will come in my name saying, I am he, and the end has drawn near. Do not go after them. So here is Jesus warning against premature declarations of the nearness of the end. Here is Peter 2,000 years ago who said the end had drawn near. Was Peter a false prophet? But we're not through. John in the book of Revelation. Now notice in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8, these false prophets are going to say, the time, the kairos, has drawn near. Do not believe them. Here is John, who heard that warning about making premature declarations of the end, but who was also told, here are the signs of the end. When you see these things come to pass, then know that it, that is the end, that is the kingdom, that is the parousia, then know that it is nigh, even at the door. Now, wait a minute. We talked about that. One of the signs that Jesus gave was, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations, then comes the end. Oh, but wait, there was another sign. When you see, Jesus told his apostles, the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then let those who read understand. Flee. Let those who are in Judea flee, for then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the foundation of the world, nor ever yet shall be. So, the appearance of the abomination of desolation and the initiation of the great tribulation were signs, a sign, if you please, that the end was at hand. The end had come. Now, I mean, you just got to catch this, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, what I'm about to share with you is, to me, absolutely devastating, and it points out how, what word should I use here? I will use an extremely strong word. How perverse the attempts to avoid the time statements really are. So remember, the apostles asked Jesus, give us a sign of the coming of the end of the age. Jesus said the gospel would be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. The gospel was preached into all the world, and the apostles proclaimed, the end is drawn near. But Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand. Let those who are in Judea flee, for then shall be great tribulation, such as not been since the foundation of the world. So the appearance of the abomination of desolation and the beginning of the great tribulation were signs of the end. Now catch the power of this. In the book of Revelation, John says, I, John, the apostle, am your brother in the kingdom and in the tribulation. Not just some tribulation, but the tribulation. Then in Revelation chapter 7, 14 and following, John saw the 144,000. They were the righteous remnant of old covenant Israel, out of all 12 tribes of Israel. In Revelation chapter 14, we see that 144,000, and they are described in the following way. John sees the 144,000, and the angel asked him, who are these? And he said, I don't know, you know, so please tell me. And the angel said, these are the first fruits. These are those who are not defiled by women. These are those who do not tell a lie. These are the first fruits of those redeemed to God from man. So, catch the power of this, ladies and gentlemen. The 144,000 were out of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 144,000 were the first fruit Christians. That means they were the first generation of Christians. Now look, James wrote in James chapter 1, as he wrote to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, of his own will begat he us by the word of God, that we should be a kind of first fruits unto him. Now, James, wait. What, James, what did you say? Writing to Christians, Jewish Christians in the first century, he said, we are first fruits. Now, let me make this clear. Folks, we today cannot be the first fruits. First fruits means first. Not 40 generations later, not 50 generations later, first generation. So the 144,000 were the first generation of Jewish Christians. Oh, but wait, we're not done. Back to Revelation chapter 7. John was asked, who are these? And he says, I don't know. You know, so you tell me. These are those who have followed the Lamb wherever he goes, and they have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. And they come out of the great tribulation. Oh, wow. Did you catch that? The 144,000 are the first generation of Jewish Christians. That means they're first generation, first century Christians. But the 144,000 would experience the Great Tribulation. That means the Great Tribulation, the sign of the end, was in the first century. Jesus said, when you see these things, what things? The signs of the end, which was inclusive of the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation, know that it is nigh, even at the door. John, who was one of the first fruits, was in the tribulation, and he wrote about the 144,000 who were the first generation of Christians from the first century, and he said, these come out of the Great Tribulation. That means John was one of them. He was experiencing the Great Tribulation. That means that the sign of the abomination of desolation, the sign of the Great Tribulation was in the first century, which meant that John was absolutely right and correct to say, the time has drawn near. He wasn't premature. He was right on time. The end truly was at hand. And I'm out of time. I'll see you next week.